Thank you for coming to this evening's event. I'm Linda Mulroy Bowden, and I serve as Executive Director of Student Life and Development and the university's Title IX Coordinator. And we are so happy to have Professor Shamus Khan visiting us today. Professor Khan co-authored Sexual Citizens, a landmark study of sex, power, and assault on campus, alongside Professor Jennifer Hirsch. Professor Khan is a professor of sociology and American Studies at Princeton University. Professor Hirsch is a professor of socio-medical sciences at Columbia's Mailman School of Public Health. Together, they co-directed the ethnographic component of SHIFT, a multi-year study of sexual health and sexual violence at Columbia University. This led to the release of their groundbreaking book, listed as NPR's Best Books of 2020. Before we get started, I do want to provide you all with a content warning. Components of the book do describe sexual assaults, and some of those stories may be discussed today. The university's sexual violence victims advocate is with us today, and a list of university resources can be found on the back table. Caden Carpentier from the Department of Campus Climate will be facilitating the discussion today. Let's give a big hand for our special guest.
Excellent. Oh yeah, we're good. Thank you so much, Linda. I also want to add a quick note that not only are we going to be potentially hearing some stories that describe sexual assaults, but we do have mandated reporters in the room, so as we get to the Q&A section, if you would like to provide a question that might be related to a personal experience, I suggest offering like a hypothetical or not personalizing it, because unfortunately we do have folks who will have to, act upon that. So will the QR code that was on the back table links to a page to anonymously submit questions. So if you have questions for Professor Khan, we do have an option for you to ask that anonymously. Otherwise, we will have folks in the audience with microphones who will come around and ask as well. All right, we'll go ahead. Do you want to introduce yourself a little bit, talk a little bit?
I'm happy to just jump in.
All right, we're just going to jump in. Okay. Shamus, can you tell us about the SHIFT study and how you got involved with that work?
Sure. So first, thank you to all of you for being here, for arranging a really wonderful visit. It's great to be back in Wisconsin. I did my PhD at UW-Madison, and I was living in Madison from September until March of this last sort of year and a half. So it's great to be back for me. I'm going to just start with a story to try and bring you into the book and the arguments of the book, and then maybe back out to talk about why we did the research and how we sort of thought about sexual violence in a pretty different way. And, you know, Lucy was a pretty unexperienced freshman, and she'd been fairly isolated before she got to Columbia. And she had a plan for how she was going to deal with that. In paraphrasing her, she said she was excited to meet some boys, make out, and in her words, lose her virginity. And so early in her freshman year, sort of on the opening days of orientation, she was pretty excited when her friend Nancy said, like, hey, do you want to go to the bars? And, you know, she did. And, you know, in New York, in Morningside Heights, it's not that hard if you're a woman to get into bars, even if you have a pretty bad fake ID. She had a pretty bad fake ID, but she got in. And while she was there, she and Nancy ended up meeting two seniors. Scott was one of them, and they sort of danced, and Scott bought her drinks and made out a little on the dance floor. And Scott asked her if she wanted to go back to his fraternity, and she did. And so kind of in the warm summer night, they leave the bar, and they go back to his house. And her phone starts to ring, and it's ringing and ringing and ringing, and she's like hoping it's not her mom. But as it turns out, it isn't her mom. It's her friend Nancy, who she'd left behind. And Nancy had like gotten that bystander intervention training that so many students get in the opening days of campus. And so they waited. She and Scott, Lucy and Scott, waited for Nancy to meet them, to join up with them. They get to the fraternity, and Scott asks the girls, as women are referred to on campus typically, if they wanted a drink. And they did. But fraternities at Columbia aren't allowed to serve hard alcohol. It doesn't mean they don't do it. It just means that they serve it somewhere other than the public spaces. And so they walked up to the second floor, and Scott made the girls 2 drinks. Nancy pretty much immediately passed out. She didn't have a lot of drinking experience. And Scott asked Lucy if she wanted to go further upstairs into his bedroom. And she did. And so they went upstairs to his bedroom, and they're making out. Everything's going great until Scott starts to unbutton Lucy's pants. And she says very clearly, "No, don't," to which he said, "It's okay." But it wasn't okay. When Lucy told us that story, she had never told it to anybody as an assault. Later, the next morning, she talked about it to her friends as like a crazy experience about losing your virginity to a total stranger. And that story is hard to hear. And it kind of encapsulates a very typical vision of what a college assault is. And often people hear that story and they think, Scott, what a terrible person. And, it's not a bad take. But Jennifer and I, in writing Sexual Citizens, try to move the conversation in a different direction. In part because we argue that we can't punish our way out of the problem. That just simply finding people like Scott and getting rid of them in our communities is not going to be a sufficient way to dealing with campus sexual assault or sexual assault more generally. Instead, what we need to do, Jennifer and I argue, is take a public health approach and to think much more about prevention. Our point here isn't that adjudication is bad or that we shouldn't pay any attention to it. It's that we can't operate on the assumption that responding to assaults after they happen is going to be what gets us to preventing assaults from happening in the first place. We know this about so many things. We know it about crime, for example, that punishing people after they've committed a crime is not actually a very effective way of preventing crime. There may be lots of reasons why we want to do that, but prevention isn't really an effective way. Prevention isn't super effective if it's just all about punishment. And so what Jennifer and I wanted to do in writing this book is to really open up the conversation and to think about how it is that assault is built into the campus environment, how to read that story of Scott and Lucy a little bit differently. And I'll sort of provide a rereading of that story as we go through this conversation. And while it may seem really scary to say that assault is built into the campus environment, Jennifer and I think of it as a vision grounded more in empathy and hope. Because if you can see how assault is built into the environment, you can begin to see how to build it out. So rather than just thinking about how do we find people and punish them, we begin to ask, how do we design different kinds of communities that make the kind of experience that Lucy had less likely to happen?
Thank you so much. I appreciate that. It kind of reminds me of accountability not having to include punishment. There are multiple layers to accountability that you can have. Wow, this is intense. This is definitely louder than the first time. Okay. Can you talk a little more about the key concepts of the book, such as sexual citizens, sexual projects, and sexual geographies?
Sure. So the analytic lens that Jennifer and I use are these 3 ideas: sexual projects, sexual citizenship, and sexual geographies. And I'm going to tell you another story, and then I'm going to loop back into these concepts through it. So when we talked to Charisma, she described Columbia as a white space and a white institution. And what she meant by that, in her words, paraphrased, was it was filled with white guys who drank too much, couldn't dance, listened to shitty music, and didn't find her attractive. And she clearly didn't find them attractive either. And so she ended up talking with her roommate and meeting a guy who lived not on campus, but away in Brooklyn. And for those of you who don't know the sort of geography of New York, Morningside Heights, where Columbia is in Manhattan, kind of the tip of Manhattan. Brooklyn's not far away, it's like 10 miles. But if the trains are running really poorly, it can take like an hour and a half to get there, sometimes even 2 hours. And it was one of those days. And so Charisma gets on the train, somehow miraculously ends up meeting up with this guy. She'd lost his address, she'd lost his phone number, but still things kind of managed to work out. She gets back to his apartment, they have a drink, they smoke part of a joint, they start to make out. He puts his hand on her thigh, she moves it away, And he puts it right back. And as she told us this story, she said, you know, I didn't really have a plan B. My plan A was always body language, and it had worked for me before, and it didn't work in this case. Now, in that story, which is part of a long series of stories that we tell about Charisma's experience, you could again think like, wow, that guy, you know, should have responded a little bit better. And later in the story, we talk about how when they're having sex, in Charisma's direct words, she explicitly says, no, stop. And she justifies that he must not really have understood that she didn't want to have sex anymore because he repositioned them. And so he must have thought she reasoned that she was uncomfortable. Again, you could think about this guy and you could think about like, wow, what a terrible person. We need to find guys like that. And Jennifer and I think there are things that we need to do for men who are acting this way in sexual situations. But our read through this story comes in a different kind of light. And we use sexual projects, sexual citizenship, and sexual geographies to kind of read through why it is that Scott and Lucy's story or Charisma's story happen. So sexual projects is the answer to the question, what is sex for? And you might think like only an academic could ask a question like, what is sex for? Isn't it really obvious? But it's not obvious. None of the students, 0, that we spoke to were trying to have children. In fact, they were all trying pretty dutifully to avoid having children. And so sex wasn't about procreation for them. Sex was kind of pleasurable for some people, but it wasn't pleasurable for a lot of them. There's a well-documented orgasm gap on college campuses where men's experience of sexual pleasure is much greater than women's. And so like thinking that people are having sex for pleasure may apply to some men. It doesn't apply to most women who frequently don't experience much sexual pleasure in the sex they're having. Sex can be about status. It can be about coming to understand who you are. The point that we try to make in the book is that we need to figure out and have a better understanding of what people are trying to do with their sex lives to understand why it is that they're in the sexual situations that they're in. Lucy was super clear about her sexual project. She wanted to make out, meet some boys, and eventually lose her virginity. She just didn't want to do it in the way that she did with Scott. Charisma had kind of no clue about her sexual project. She grew up in a context of sexual silence and shame, and nobody ever talked to her about what sex was for. No one ever had a conversation that went something like, look, sex is going to be a really important part of your life. You need to figure out what you want from that part of your life. So sexual projects helps us see why people are seeking the kinds of sex that they're having. And I tend to be very not judgmental about people's sexual projects. So like, if people want to hook up, they should hook up. If they want to not have sex, they should not have sex. If they want to have sex in the context of a committed relationship, that's fine. If they want to cheat, go ahead, right? Like, I am pretty agnostic about it all. Where I'm not agnostic, and where Jennifer and I come in a much more moralistic way, is not about whether or not like particular kinds of sex are good or bad, which is usually the language of sex and morality. It's about how we treat other people. So the second concept, sexual citizenship, is the idea that we all have the right to sexual self-determination. Everyone in this room has the right to sexual self-determination. But we don't just have that right, we also have an obligation to recognize that the people we're with have the same exact sets of rights. And so this is a point where Jennifer and I become kind of moralistic because it's a question of how we treat each other. The first part of sexual citizenship is a little bit of a provocation. It says to you all, actually, people have the right to sexual self-determination. And if young people want to have sex, they have the right to do that. And what we saw again and again was the denial of people's right to sexual self-determination, frequently by the communities and families that they were raised within. And to us, that denial happened more frequently with women, genderqueer, LGBTQ folks than it did with other kinds of folks. And that was part of a systematic denial of the equal standing of people. When we look at the story of Scott, or we look at the story of and Lucy, or we look at Charisma, Jennifer and I see a profound failure of sexual citizenship on the part of those men. Because while they, in part, had a deep sense of their own right to sexual self-determination, they also had a sense of their partners just not being equivalent human beings. When Lucy says to Scott, no, don't, and he says, it's okay, he basically is like erasing her right to any kind of self-determination. And so one of the things that we argue is that communities need to think much more clearly about how they're cultivating people's sexual projects and having people have greater clarity on that, whether that's a project of abstinence or hooking up or a committed relationship, and that they need to create a moral context for understanding sexuality where people recognize the people that they're with as fundamentally equivalent human beings. The final concept, sexual geographies, is the thing that I think most communities can kind of apply really directly to make transformations in their campuses. And it's that space matters. I started Charisma's story by talking about it as a white institution and guys who can't dance and drink too much, not like to try and get a laugh out of you, but actually because I wanted to highlight the idea of sexual geographies. What does it mean for an institution to be a white space? Or what does it mean for an institution to be a male-dominated institution? Well, what it partially means is that the social spaces are not equally distributed across different kinds of students, and some students have way more power across campus, in part because of their control over space. There's sort of three critical elements to the Charisma story. The first part is that her experience of campus social life as a space of whiteness drove her off campus. That doesn't mean to me that like, oh, Brooklyn is a dangerous place. I was born in Brooklyn, so I don't like think of it as a terribly dangerous place, but that she was moved away from places where lots of her friends were, where she could have encounters surrounded by people she might be living with who would be looking out for her. The second part of it is that Charisma wasn't a wealthy student. So there are a lot of really rich kids at Columbia, and many of them, if they found themselves in a bad situation in Brooklyn, could just like open up an app on their phone and get a car to drive them home. But that's a $50 car ride. Charisma didn't have 50 bucks. And so that was really important. Here we see sort of how Charisma's, the racialization of space, her lack of economic opportunity or not economic opportunity, her lack of economic resources, and the racialization of campus space all laid the groundwork for her experience. We can also begin to analyze the Scott and Lucy story with that and see how, what does it mean that Scott was in a dorm, or really a fraternity, where he lived, where he was surrounded by his friends, where all of these dynamics were kind of central to what was going on. So that's how we sort of begin to use these three concepts to change the perspective, not from just thinking about how do we find and punish people, but instead, what is a different kind of analytic lens that gives us positive things we might be able to do? Clarity on sexual projects, cultivating sexual citizenship, making sure that there are geographies of equality that might help us transform campus environments.
I appreciate that, thank you. So you'd mentioned that the setting of the study is in New York City. How do you feel a rural campus like Platteville and community can be impacted by the key concepts of the book that you just described?
Yeah, so one of the things that Jennifer and I are working on right now is trying to make sure that campuses can actually use this in a way to do a sort of self-study. And I hesitate to say, like, this is how things work at Platteville, because I don't know anything about Platteville, right? I mean, I know that there's the world's largest M, I know a few other things, but like not that much. And it would be like beyond arrogant. It would actually just be really irresponsible for me to be like, here's what you do at Platteville. Instead, what I think that you can begin to do is ask like, okay, what are the range of sexual projects that are operative within our community? And how is it that we're helping people have greater amounts of clarity on those? What are the sets of things that we're doing to affirm everybody's sexual citizenship, both in terms of people's right to their own understanding of self-determination, but also their moral commitment to other people in the community and beyond, to viewing them as equal people? And then I think most of all, like, what are you doing at Platteville that's building geographies of equality? There are so many geographies of inequality at college campuses. So college campuses, you know, if you think about the Greek life system, it is frequently a system built on inequality. So by national rule, I know that people don't always adhere to this, the very gendered policy that men's organizations are allowed to serve alcohol and women's organizations are not, effectively gives men control over the contexts where socialization happens. Now, that doesn't make those men bad people, but it does create a context where existing power inequalities are already augmented. it also makes alcohol a much more central part of socialization on campuses. Because we know from national statistics that men drink way more than women do. And so if men are in control of the party, there's gonna be a lot more alcohol. And so that tells us something, like that is fundamentally a geography of inequality. We also see how sexuality, class, race are all integral to understanding who has control over space and spaces of socialization on campus. And what you might begin to do then is start to kind of look at the spaces where people socialize and ask, who has control over these spaces? Why do they have control over these spaces? And is that something that is making our campus a more equitable place or a less equitable place? The perspective that Jennifer and I are advancing is really one grounded in a long tradition in sexual assault research in thinking about gender and power as central to understanding why assault happens. But what we argue is that gender is not the only form of power on campus. There are lots of other forms of power. And being powerful people doesn't make people bad. But if we build institutions that augment rather than moderate existing inequalities, what we are effectively doing is building institutions where harms, of which sexual assault is one, are more rather than less likely to happen. And so I would say, like, you know, as a community, one of the things that you can do is begin to do a kind of space audit and begin to ask, like, what are the spaces of socialization? Who has control over those spaces? What does that do in terms of who has already a lot of power on campus? And how could we not, like, take that away from people, but instead build multiple other forms of communities that make equity more likely to happen in our campus?
Thank you. Within the book, you mentioned the importance of early sexual health education, but for many students, they aren't receiving that education until they get to college. What advice would you provide to universities regarding providing that sexual education once students arrive?
Yeah, I mean, college is too late. I mean, college is too late for these conversations. I shouldn't say it's too late because it needs to happen in college, but think for a moment about, like, your sex ed. When we asked students about their sex ed, most of them kind of laughed and were like, oh, you mean my sexual diseases course? Because it was like a course where you were shown pictures of STIs or all kinds of things where it was like, here's how you could get syphilis and things would be terrible. Or like, gonorrhea is gonna be the worst thing ever. Like, when you get strep throat, your doctor doesn't say to you like, wow, you're a terrible person. What do? They give you some antibiotics and they're like, don't give anybody else strep for a while. This will make you better, right? But that is not our approach to sex, right? It is actually grounded frequently in shame, where sex ed is basically a kind of horrors of what happens if you have sex. Somebody could get pregnant if you're heterosexual, and then like you have to carry something heavy around, right? Like that little bag of flour or something awful. You could get an STI, and then like, you know, terrible things will happen. You'll be infertile, or, you know, you never again are lovable because you're polluted. Like, these are messages that we give young people, and they're terrible messages to give young people. Wisconsin doesn't mandate sex ed, and that is a decision that's made on a political level in Wisconsin that guarantees higher rates of sexual assault. So part of the research that Jennifer and I were a part of noted that for women who had had comprehensive sex ed before getting to college, they were half as likely to be raped. That is a huge effect size. So for those of you who aren't sort of like quantitative social scientists, there are very, very few things that like we could find an effect size that big for. The effect of education on earnings, that is the correlation of those two things, is like 0.6. Which is, you know, that basically says for the mathy people in the room, like, you know, the variation that's explained by differences in people's earnings is around 0.6, which is pretty high. We effectively have something that is hugely, hugely protective against rape, and we choose not to do it. In part because what we often convey to young people is that sex is a dirty, rotten, nasty thing that you should only do to somebody you love after you're married to them. And like, that is not a message in conveying to young people that actually sets them up for a future within which they can thrive. So if you think back to that, like for women who have sex ed, they're half as likely to be raped. There's also considerable evidence that for men who receive sex ed, they're less likely to assault people. And so we have what is, in effect, a kind of vaccine against rape. And yet we choose not to use it. Or we do use it, but we use it in highly inequitable ways, so that people in highly resourced school environments, and often private schools, are getting it, and others are not. There are national standards on sex ed. And for the students sitting here, like, I think you should think about focusing on your campus, but you should also think about beyond it. For a moment, like, why are we all wearing masks right now? Well, it's kind of like, you know, maybe it's theater, maybe it's like a public health response. I used to be a professor of public health, so really, it's the idea that, like, we are responsible for one another. We are going to encounter other people, and that responsibility has a deep extension to other kinds of communities. If we just focused on getting things at Platteville right, we wouldn't actually do much for the communities around Platteville. And you might also recognize that, like, chances are the fellow students at UW-Platteville are not going to be the only people you have intimate encounters with in your life. Many of you will graduate and likely meet other people. What happens if they haven't had the kind of effective interventions that you've experienced? You're likely to be exposed to harm. Or think about how, for people who are not in college and university, their likely experience of sexual assault is considerably higher. That is, for students who are not in college and university, for women, their risk of being assaulted is about 20% higher. And so we might begin to think, like, what could we do about this? And the answer is that there are national standards for sexuality education that are very effective at helping prevent sexual harm. They're also very effective at helping prevent things like childhood sexual abuse. And so we should think about, like, what would it look like to institute this? And for you all, what would it look like not just to try and institute fundamental sex ed in your community, but to use some of your power? You may not think you have much, but you do, to actually put pressure on legislatures from your home communities and from the Platteville area to say, like, this is something that Wisconsin needs to do because it's highly protective. And before you tell me that, like, oh no, there are too many conservative people in this state, there is bipartisan agreement among parents on the value of sex ed. I will send all the receipts to the folks who invited me and sort of push you to begin to think about, like, what would it mean to normalize an idea of sexuality as a fundamental part of your education? I'm going off on this a little bit, but I want to say one more thing. Like, I don't know, ask yourselves, how many people have had, like, the following conversation with somebody in their life? You got to work hard in high school because, like, we need to make sure you get into college, and then in college you got to work hard, pick the right major so that you're setting yourself up for a career that's successful. You need to get, like, the right kind of job, et cetera, so that you are on a pathway to success in life. And where success in life is largely defined by your career trajectory. By contrast, I wonder how many of you have had a conversation that said something like, you have to think about what you want from your intimate life. Because as it turns out, that intimate life is going to be the way that you connect with some of the people who are most important to you, the people who you're likely to be partnered with. And it's not something that you can just put off and figure out later. It's something that you should intentionally practice. And you should think about who you want to be in that intimate context. My guess is that lots of you have had the former conversation about the value of career, and very few have had conversations about the value of sex and intimacy to building a life with other people. And that, to me, is not a failure of college students. It's actually a failure of people my age, right, who have raised you all into a totally impoverished context of an understanding of what intimacy should mean for you and who you want to be in that context. And our failure to do that, alongside our failure to provide really effective sex education to you all, has actually exposed you to a lot of harm. But it's something that we can change. It's like literally something we can do. There are very great, some religious-based, some totally secular, national standards on sexuality education that, like, are very learnable, and it's a public policy we could begin to advance.
Thank you, I appreciate that. And tangents welcome. I think it's all very useful. Okay, so I would like to pivot and make sure that we have time for audience questions. So we did have one come in on the forum. How does pornography come into play in how we learn how to have sex?
You know, I am not at all, and Jennifer is not like anti-porn. We're also not particularly pro-porn. And there's some really interesting work on like porn literacy. My view of porn is basically this, that like porn is harmful, but the harmful effects of porn are largely because of our collective commitment to sexual ignorance among young people. So like, if porn is the only form of sexual education that people are getting about what sex is, that's a huge problem. But I don't view that as a problem of porn. I also think the porn genie is like out of the bottle, right? Like we're not gonna kind of mandate the total retraction of porn. What we could do is like make porn less interesting, and I don't mean we should make porn boring. What I mean is that like, instead of like thinking about how when young people have questions about sex, we sort of say like, not under my roof, or la la la, or we hand them a book and we're like, I don't wanna have a conversation about this. What would it look like to open up conversations about that, to actually talk to them about sex, so that porn wasn't like the sole thing that is driving young people's sexual education? Right now, we kind of expect people to be able to express their sexual wants and desires verbally as part of affirmative consent, and yet frequently raise them up that when like young people ask about sex, we shame them or tell them we don't want to hear about it. One of the young women we spoke to, when talking about the relationship between alcohol and sex, said, drinking before sex is like Novocaine before the dentist. It just numbs me for what I'm about to do. And like, that is a horrible perspective to have on sex, but it's a perspective that she was taught, in effect, because of a deep sense of sexual shame. And I think that if we begin to combat that sexual shame, if we actually have a much more proactive view of sexual education, we can moderate the negative effects of porn basically by being like, well, this isn't the only place you're gonna learn from it. This is like paid actors. We don't teach people to drive by being like, hey, why don't you go watch this weird chase movie of like Matt Damon driving through Italy in a wild way, and then be like, well, we did our job, right? We like helped them learn how to drive. Like, but that's kind of what porn is. It's a total fantasy of what people's bodies look like, of how they have sex, but that's the only thing we give them access to. And like, that is a very irresponsible thing to do as a community.
Appreciate that, thank you. All right, we don't have another one on the forum, so is anybody, yeah, can we get a microphone there?
Why don't you talk and then I can repeat your question? The question was, what role do dating apps play in our study? So dating apps wasn't something we explicitly looked at, although it is something that we saw a lot of. First, I just want to backtrack one step, and then I'm going to fully answer your question. There is a view that young people today are hypersexualized and having lots of sex. But young people today are having less sex than their parents had, and their age at first sex is slightly older. So before like we begin with a terrain of a conversation about the wildness of sexuality among young people today, the best evidence that we have right now is that actually the age of first sex is going up and the number of sexual partners is going down. The reason I raise that is that frequently we point to dating apps as like, and I'm thinking here like less of dating apps, I'm also thinking of like hookup apps, as like the source of cheap and easy sex that is promoting lots of sex. And I would say that like the way that we saw people use dating apps was like one of many resources to help them figure things out. Like, how do you know if somebody's straight or gay? How do you know what they're interested in? Like, these apps help you limit the set of people that you might actually feasibly be of interest to and interested in. Like, is somebody single, right? Seeing them on a dating app is a pretty good sign. It's not a perfect one, but it's like a decent sign that at least like they're open to sexual contact with other people other than the relationship that they're currently in, or that they're not in a relationship. And so like, you know, there are times where the dating app is like, you know, also a huge menu of options of things that people are into or not into. And it can make sex feel super transactional. But from my perspective, the transactional character of sex and sexuality today among young people, first of all, it isn't leading to more sex. And secondly, it is a symptom, not a cause. So what I mean by that is that the transactional nature of sex that we observed was frequently tied to two things. One, students said to us, you know, having a partner is like taking an extra 4-credit class. Like, it's just a lot of work. And that is a values thing. It's like, you know, taking classes is a really valuable thing. Taking extra classes for out credit, not so valuable. And having an analogy of relationships as that is kind of part of the problem. And that's not a problem of young people. It's actually a problem, I think, again, as I said earlier, of us. But also, you know, what we frequently saw was that young people tried to find sexual partners who were on the periphery of their social groups, not in the core part of their social groups, because they anticipated the termination of the relationship and were like, when that happens, I don't want it to affect the things that really matter for me, which is like my capacity to get my work done, my friendships, and other kinds of things like that. That is sort of a continuation of that transactional dimension. And I think it's partially because culturally we have systematically devalued sexuality and intimacy among young people. And like, you all have learned that lesson really, really well. And it hasn't led to tons of sex, actually. But what it has led to is a very, very transactional orientation to sex and intimacy in ways that I think are quite harmful for young people.
Thank you. Great question. We had another one come in on the app. At what point in a child's life do they become conscious of themselves? And when should my body, my choice be implemented?
Fetuses masturbate in the womb. So, like, you know, we should be aware that, like, the idea of sexual pleasure is something that happens very early on. They're not cognizant of what it is that they're doing, but, like, you know, why do children play with their genitals? Because it feels good, right? Like, they're, like, kind of happy about it. And I think, you know, the idea of when we should be doing sex ed, like, I think we need to do it from the beginnings of people's birth. And let me be very clear about that. We should not be teaching young people about the mechanics of sex very early in life. But we should be teaching them about things about bodily recognition of other people and their right to bodily autonomy. Like, it's important not to make young children kiss their uncle if they don't want to, right? And because conveying that to them, you don't have to kiss people you don't want to kiss, you don't have to hug people you don't want to hug, is a lesson in their right to self-determination, their actual right to their own body and their own space. So I think, like, those lessons need to be taught very early on. And actually, it is part of what we teach. Like, being in kindergarten is partially a lesson in, like, learning to sit in a chair for a long period of time and learning not to touch other people, right? And that touch isn't sexual touch. It's, like, all kinds of touch, but, like, we effectively convey that lesson. Like, I have never met in my professional life a biter, right? Like, none of my colleagues has ever bit me. And that's because, like, we effectively communicated to all of my colleagues who were biters that they shouldn't do that, that they need to figure out ways to respect other people's bodies. And so, you know, effective sexuality education isn't just about sex. It's about respect and recognition. It's about realizing that, like, even as 2- and 3-year-olds, there are things that we can do as part of sex ed that never mention sex. That's really important. The other thing that we need to do is to, like, convey to young people that they shouldn't have shame in their bodies. And so, you know, masturbating, like, it's not really a dinner table activity, right? Like, you can do that alone in your room, but conveying to young people that their bodies are fundamentally disgusting things, or that they should feel shame about them, is a lesson that has really big impacts on people's subsequent lives. When we refuse to name body parts, like if we're like pee-pee and hoo-ha, Like, imagine navigating the world where we never used the word elbow because, like, elbows were seen as profoundly shameful things that couldn't actually be named. It is that thing that cannot be named. Well, like, why can't it be named? What's wrong with it? You all probably read, like, Harry Potter at some point, right? Like, the idea that, like, if you say that name, it does something really powerful and wrong, and so we're going to create an alternate set of names for it, that empowers some kinds of lessons about shame that we should be feeling. And if you think of the woman who talked about alcohol as Novocaine, or if you think about all of the kind of harms that we do to people who are genderqueer, to people who have other sexualities, by conveying something that's fundamentally wrong with them, like, that is what we're doing with young children. We're sort of laying the groundwork for that. And so, you know, what we're really advocating for is not that we educate young people about the mechanics of sex. Like, we also don't advocate for, like, the kind of sex ed that so many people get, which is about, like, fallopian tubes and eggs and uteruses, like, and you're like, this is how the thing moves. Like, how many of you know how to drive? I would guess most of the people in this room. How many of you know how spark plugs work, right? Like, we don't teach driving by being like, this is the role of the spark plug in the internal combustion engine, right? Like, that is not a necessary piece of information to navigate the road. And yet we act like that is a necessary, or actually the only piece of information that is kind of safe thing to convey about sex and sexuality to young people. And so what we're asking is that, like, we traverse that a little bit. I'm actually very pro learning about physiology and biology as part of sex ed, but I think, like, if it's all you're teaching people, that's a really impoverished conversation. And so I don't know enough about, like, the second part of the question on, like, mind-body awareness stuff. It's not really, like, I'm a very dorky, like, kind of quanti social scientist. So just, you know, take that from me. That's who I am. And, well, you don't have to, but you can, you know, you should know that. And so I would say, like, I'm not so good at that second part of it, but I think we teach young kids all kinds of moral lessons that are about their bodies and their place in the world. And then we kind of create a little bit of a firewall between that and sex. And what would it mean to take down that? And to actually teach them those lessons about bodily autonomy, respect for other people, and actually build bridges between that and their intimate lives.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we had a couple come in at the same time, so here we go. Can you explain or expand more on your study with the LGBTQIA+ community?
Absolutely. So the LGBTQIA+ population has some of the highest rates of assault of any community. And that's super important because, like, if you just take a perspective of rape culture, say, or toxic masculinity, it doesn't really get you to explaining why that happens, right? Like, you'd have to be like, well, clearly queer people have a really, like, predominant rape culture in their community, and that just happens to, that is not my perspective on it. Instead, what you think about is structural and institutional homophobia and queer erasure. That's a real central part of that. So let me just tell kind of like 2 to 3 stories about this to try and highlight it. All the names that I use, by the way, are pseudonyms. So Adam was from a very, very conservative Midwestern family, and he couldn't be out, and he was super excited to move to New York because he was like, great, I'm gonna go to this gay mecca, and I'm gonna finally meet gay men, and it's gonna be great. And then he got to New York, and he met gay men, and he was like, this isn't great, because, like, everyone that he sort of reached out to was interested in, like, hooking up with him, but then they would ghost him, right? Like, they would, like, fake an interest and intimacy and then be like, never talk to him again. And this was a very unpleasant experience for him because it's not what he wanted. He didn't want to really hook up. And so he spoke really lovingly about, like, finally finding a relationship and being in this relationship with this guy and feeling like everything had come together, except Adam said, he's really forceful about sex sometimes. And then he told us a story about how his boyfriend came home one night pretty drunk, and in Adam's words, he basically raped me. Adam refused to call it a rape. Even though he said he basically raped me, he backtracked very quickly. He never talked to his friends about it because he didn't want his friends to hate his boyfriend. He pushed it out of his mind really quickly because the relationship was so valuable to him that like thinking about his boyfriend as a predator or somebody who was just a terrible human being wasn't something he was willing to do. And so, and he couldn't think even about raising it with his boyfriend because he was like, I don't know how that conversation is going to go and it's too scary to me. I don't want to go back on that market. Now, you could read that story and think like, wow, what's going on with Adam? And I think there's a bunch of things. One, we can use the idea of sexual project, sexual citizenship to kind of read through it. But, you know, the silence and shame that was really institutionalized in Adam's experience growing up is essential to understanding that story. Like, he did not think that he had the right to sexual self-determination, in part because so many lessons that he'd gotten in his own life were about the total illegitimacy of his sexuality. And so we read that as like the community that Adam came from made that silence and fear the defining characteristic of his sexuality. Two other stories. Maddie was assigned male at birth and had transitioned in her identity to identify as a woman and was in a relationship with someone over the course of this transition who also identified as queer. And Maddie really, really didn't want to use her penis during sex, because penile intercourse for her felt profoundly invalidating of who it was that she understood herself to be and who she'd come to be. And yet her partner pressured her again and again and again. And Maddie said, you know, her wants overtook my needs. It was just this kind of war of attrition. And another story with someone whose name I can't remember. The problem is I can remember their name. I just don't remember what we called them in the book. And so I'm not going to use the name because I don't want to out them. Was someone who used they, them pronouns. And they were in a relationship also with somebody who was genderqueer, and they were like not feeling, they had just gone on a new medication and their libido was like way down. And so they like just didn't really want to have sex. And their partner wanted to have sex and was like, why are we in this relationship if we're not having sex? Like, this doesn't make any sense. And, you know, they were like, well, I just don't have a lot of sexual desire right now. And their partner said to them, you just don't think I'm beautiful. And for the student at the time, like, that cut really deep because they sort of knew what it felt like to, you know, have an experience in a body where they felt like the world didn't see them as beautiful, that they didn't see their body as a legitimate body. And so then they said, like, you know, I kind of consented to sex that I really didn't want to have because I sort of figured that, like, the harm of not having sex with my partner was a greater harm to them than the harm of my having non-consensual sex. And so they sort of read this as like an act of queer solidarity, right? And that all of the harms that their partner had had as a fellow genderqueer person, they were pretty profound harms. And they were like, you know, I just can't layer onto that by making this person feel like they're not beautiful. And whether or not that story, I didn't interview the person's partner, so I don't know if that was just like sheer emotional manipulation or like a real sentiment that that person had at the time. But for me, it's kind of hard to read through that story and think like, oh, that story isn't built on anything other than, or not anything, but is firmly built on a foundation of the denial of genderqueer forms of identity and sexuality and the harms that folks had experienced over their life course that, like, you know, their partner just didn't want to seek to like add to. And so here, part of the lesson that we took away from a lot of the analysis, and I'm actually finishing up I was like sitting in the lobby actually working on one of these papers. So I'm finishing up 2 papers on this right now, is thinking about how people don't have to have power to use power. Like in the you don't think I'm beautiful moment, it isn't just that, like, from a power perspective about sexual assault, it's all about whether or not people have power or they're institutionally powerful people. There are ways that the power of, you know, organized or structural homophobia or the denial of people's sexuality is something that weighs on folks independent of whether or not the person that they're engaged with is a powerful individual. And seeing power in that way becomes very helpful, not just for making sense of the experiences of people within the queer community, but actually a wider range of experiences about the dynamics of power in a community and how that can create harms. And rather than just like stopping there with the analysis, what Jennifer and I want to do is say like, okay, so what are the concrete steps that we're going to take to moderate some of those power inequalities so that those experiences of harm are less likely to happen? And this is what like I'm pointing to again and again and again, is that like prevention strategies for assault, of course, involve consent education and bystander intervention, but they also require a much broader perspective that builds in a wide range of institutional stakeholders that begin to think about like, how is it that we've organized our community, and is that organization moderating some of the harms that people are experiencing, or is it augmenting them?
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we have one last question, but I also want to put it out to the audience. Were there any folks that want to ask a question with a mic, or just yell it out and us repeat? Okay, yeah.
So the question was, how does the decriminalization of sex work in terms of the ideas about sexual projects, sexual citizenship, sexual geographies? I'm going to be given a not very satisfying answer, which is that like I have strong personal opinions on this, but I tend to try when giving talks to stay in my lane. And my lane is like the sets of things I actually know about, right? So like to make a distinction between my opinion on an instance like that versus what is either my own empirical research or a broader empirical research say about that. I will say that like in our own context, and this isn't about sex work, it's instead about the criminalization of sexual activity, of any kind of sexual activity, it's that, you know, broadly what Jennifer and I argue throughout the book is that response is important, but like the regulation of sex and sexuality and figuring out ways to effectively punish things for sex and sexuality is largely not going to get us towards positive community transformation, and in all likelihood is going to disproportionately harm already disempowered people. So that if our focus is really on response, it will tend to be like queer people and people of color who are brought up before response mechanisms way more than others, and people who are institutionally less powerful. And if you're like, really? Is that really the case? I'll just note that white Americans do more drugs than black Americans, and black Americans are 10 times more likely to be brought in front of a judge for some kind of drug violation. So, you know, pretty hard to think about that as anything other than if we really, really focus on the criminalization of drug activity, the rates of drug activity are not actually going to be reflected in how it is that we address instances that we view as violation of drug use, or just thought of differently. Like, my guess is that very, very few students at UW-Platteville have been arrested for smoking pot over the last, I don't know, 50 years. And those students have smoked a lot of pot. So like that gives you a kind of sense of like what it is that criminalization in general does, because if we were to compare that to other communities, we would see something dramatically different.
I appreciate it, thank you. I did a quick glance and I saw all the res lifers like, yes, lots of pot. Okay, I want to be—
Is it illegal here in Wisconsin?
It is, yes,
okay.
Yes.
Don't smoke pot. I'm kidding. Was there one last question?
Yes, one last one, and I do want to be mindful of your time. We're just a minute past 5:30.
Okay.
The last question: how does hypersexualization in media adversely affect relationships and sex among college-age students?
So again, this isn't really something I study, so I'm going to punt a little bit about it. But I will again just focus on how hypersexualization in the media has not led to massive increases in sexual activity. If anything, we would see considerably greater degrees of sexualization within media than we saw within your parents' generation, and you're having less sex. Now, it may lead to all kinds of other things like body dysmorphia or understandings of what sex and sexuality is like. One of the things that we heard again and again were students' anxieties about like not being good at sex. And so some people took like a very skills-based approach to their own sexual life. Like they wanted to get better at it. In the words of one guy, he was like, so I can learn to give good dick. And he was like, that was like really important to him. And the problem was that it was like a very him-centered orientation to his own sexuality, where the people that he was with, like they were just kind of there as like elements in the practice of his process of self-accomplishment. And so I think, when we think about like media representations of sex and sexuality, those raise really important challenges to us. I am just like a very pragmatic kind of social scientist, and I'm like, I just am not, like, we're not gonna ban media images. Like it's not a thing. Like we're not that kind of country, and I don't think we should be. And so instead of kind of bemoaning media representation, we might ask, like, what are the positive programs that we're building? Like, what are the actual things that we are doing within our own community that might make concrete, like, that might have concrete benefits to folks? And I'll just, like, go through a few of the things that you might think about. One is, Jennifer and I think about sexual assault as interrelated with diversity, equity, and inclusion, and mental health and substance use policy. And so part of sexual assault prevention is going to mean doing DEI work, thinking about mental health on campus, and thinking about substance use. And like mental health isn't just about hiring more counselors. Like, what does a community level mental health, intervention look like where thriving becomes a critical metric of success within a community? So like, we're not just thinking about, oh, what is the graduation rate, or like, what are GPAs, or who's going on to like professional degrees, or what's the average wage of the graduate of this institution, but we have like metrics of thriving both here and beyond. And like, we begin to think about like, what are we doing to define what we think it means to thrive as an individual, and how are we instituting that? And like, that to me is a sexual assault prevention strategy. How are we doing diversity, equity, and inclusion work to try and moderate the power inequalities that come into campus? Like, that is a sexual assault prevention strategy. How are we thinking critically about substance use on campus and the real challenges of, in particular, not only, but in particular, white men's drinking practices, which, calling out white men here, African Americans drink significantly less than white Americans, Asian Americans drink significantly less than white Americans, men drink significantly more than people with other gendered identities, and like, that is a problem because it actually exposes people to a lot of harm, and it makes them likely to harm other people, right? So like, the reason we tell you don't drink and drive is that we're not like, well, if you drink and drive, somebody else who's drunk might slam into your car and you're not going to respond quick enough. Like, that is not the drink and drive strategy. Like, it's that you might actually hurt somebody because you're not going to be effectively responsive and act in the ways that you normally would. You're not going to pick up on cues. Like, there are lots of harms that you could have. And so this means thinking about all of these things, sexual assault prevention, diversity, equity, and inclusion, substance use, and mental health, as sort of a four-pronged attack where you think, what is it that it means to thrive in our community? What are the things that we value? And how are we creating programs to actually realize them?
Excellent. Thank you so much. All right, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. Thank you so much, Professor Khan, for giving us your time and your insights. If you all would like a copy of Sexual Citizens, please get in touch with the Dean of Students office, specifically Melissa Stoner, to get a copy of that for free. And I think that's what we'll end with. So thank you all so much.
Thanks for coming.